If the average American makes 100, Dr. Sowell points out that Jews make 170, Irish 103, West Indians 94, blacks 62, and Indians 60. Now, did you factor into that age differentials or not?
No, those were gross figures.
Those are gross figures.
Yes.
So therefore, they would come together a lot more if you took out the age.
In fact, I did one set of numbers some years ago of 30-year-old males only, and there the differentials began to shrink. As you look at other things like that, the more things you hold constant, the more these numbers tend to shrink. Unfortunately, after all this time, no one has bothered that I know of to try to eliminate differences of age, differences of education, and particularly qualitative differences in education, and try to see how much is left after you've done all of that. It begins to fall away pretty rapidly, though, with some of those things.
Okay, but nevertheless, certain significant differences remain.
Major
right?
differences, and I don't want to be optimistic, because if you're poor for reason X rather than for reason Y, that is no enormous consolation. I mean, that will not impress the landlord or the people at the supermarket. The fact is, they want to know how much money do you have. And you want to know how much money you're going to get, too. So that these are major differences, and things need to be done about them. Unfortunately, politics involves telling people what they want to hear. And what people want to hear is that a certain kind of villainy can explain almost all of it. Now, there's no such thing as a lack of villainy among human beings. Anytime you take any large group of people, you have an almost inexhaustible source of sins. And if you want to look into all those sins, you can go on forever looking into them. The question is whether those sins explain the numbers you're talking about.
All right, let's grant that they don't, and go on to say what is it that does account for them, because we've eliminated genetic inclinations, we've eliminated invidious social factors, so we're left with what? For instance, region, where you come from, right?
Region makes a big difference.
Yeah, okay.
People who come from the South tend to have lower incomes, whether they're black or white.
Okay, let's say then
history.
we're talking about people in the same region.
There would still be a difference. History would be one big one.
History, what do you mean by history?
All right.
The history of the race, or the history of the personal history of when they got here, or what?
The history of the group in the United States. That, for example, the Jews who came here with all sorts of urban skills. They were clothing industries.
Garment work.
Yes, that sort of thing. The Germans came here with all sorts of skill in beer making, piano making, machinery kinds of things. Blacks, of course, emerging from slavery had enormous disadvantages, even as compared to people emerging from slavery in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Because, for one thing, in the United States, blacks were not allowed to have any responsibility under slavery. That one of the key ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. Now, people tried to do that in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't as possible, say, in the West Indies, because there weren't enough whites, for example, in the West Indies to matter. So if blacks were going to be fed in the West Indies, they had to be fed by growing their own food.
Like Angola and like the Portuguese colonies compared to, say, South Africa.
Yes. And so, therefore, the blacks, say, in the West Indies had all sorts of experience growing their own food, selling the surplus in the market, and, in fact, being responsible for budgeting what they had. Blacks in the United States were deliberately kept from having that. Dependence was seen as the key to holding the slaves down. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
Well, I was going to ask you that. You've anticipated me. To what extent do you find that the welfare state is trying to preserve an ethos which precisely, I understand you to say, we need to liberate ourselves from?
Yes, that politics really involves getting people to vote for you, and people vote for you when they think that they can depend on you, when they are dependent on you. To the extent that people become self-reliant and can feel they're perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, to that extent do you lose your hold on their votes.
That's kind of a harsh generality, isn't it? Because a lot of people who really are philanthropically minded are in favor of the kind of thing that is generally understood as charitable intercession, isn't it?
Yes, there are people who are professional politicians who simply look at the bottom line of where the votes go. There are other people who sincerely believe that if they will hand out things here and there, that this will in fact benefit people. Again, looking at
your point is it doesn't.
It doesn't. I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. I've seen many examples around the world of people who began in poverty and ended in affluence. Not one of them has followed any pattern at all like what is being advocated for blacks in the United States. Many groups have remained in poverty for a very long time trying to follow those patterns.
These sort of permanent indigent classes.
That's right. Within the blacks, there's a very diverse movement, though. On the one hand, you have blacks who are getting more education, who are going to college and so on. Their incomes are rising, not only absolutely, but relative to that of whites of the same description. It's those blacks who have not had, say, 9 years of schooling, who have not had 6 years of experience in the job market. Their incomes are declining relative to the incomes of incomes of whites. If over the very same span of time, so it can't be a matter of the business cycle or something like that, is that those blacks who have the advantages relative to others have now still more advantages. But those who had the very difficult poverty to deal with, that is becoming more difficult. A higher percentage of all black income is going to the top 20% of blacks over time.
Well, do I understand you to say that the government has exacerbated the plight of these poor blacks?
Yes.
How?
A number of ways. One, they've made it difficult to get jobs, to get started in the job market. Minimum wage law would be one of those things, but only one. The terrible schooling would be a major factor. That if you're going to turn out kids who are 40% functionally illiterate upon graduation from high school, then you're going to have very serious problems in the job market.
And the government is responsible for that?
The government
Through
runs
the
the
public
schools. Yes. State as well as federal. They're doing many things to make it much tougher for the person at the bottom to get started. And they're also making it less necessary to get started by having various subsidy programs, food stamps, welfare, and so on, which reduce the difference between working and not working. So that the general tendency of what they're doing is to make it harder to rise. But of course, if you're lucky enough to have started to rise before these programs began, then you're in great shape.